and welcome to Full Disclosure, a podcast project conceived entirely to let me spend more time with interesting people than I would ever be able to enjoy on the radio. And this week's guest I'm particularly looking forward to, Dr. Rangan Chatterjee. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
As is normal in this day and age, you have a list of job descriptions well, I was going to say as long as your arm, but you are, of course, famously long, so it might not be quite as long as your arm. How do you describe yourself?
In a professional capacity?
Yeah.
Well, the first thing I'd say is I'm a medical doctor. So I qualified from Edinburgh Medical School back in 2001. So, 23 and a half years ago? But my career has evolved somewhat since I started. So I do many things now.
Yes.
Yes, I am a medical doctor. I'm a professor at Chester Medical School, professor of health communication and education. I guess a lot of people know me best for my podcast, Feel Better, Live More. It's been going for 7 years now. So I'm a podcaster. I'm also an author, and my 6th book has just come out. So I guess doctor, professor, podcast host, and author is probably the simplest way to describe it.
If there's a uniting theme, apart from obviously medicine, although that's not quite as straightforward a term as some people think, as we'll no doubt discuss, the uniting theme is probably a sense of mission.
Yeah. I genuinely went into medicine to help people. I know it almost sounds like a bit of a cliche, but it genuinely is the truth. I actually do care about people. I care about helping people live better lives. And so, yes, when I left medical school, I thought the way I was going to do that was using the tools that I'd learnt. I would go and be a doctor and I would see patients. I would impart that information and knowledge and help them improve their lives. But actually, it's not strictly true that we always do that. I think there are some problems with medicine today. But I've also learnt, particularly when my first BBC One show came out back in 2015, Doctor in the House, where I went into families' lives, lived alongside them for 4 to 6 weeks, and helped all manner of people get better, either have their condition reversed or significantly improved by paying attention to their nutrition, their lifestyle, and their mindset. That, James, was the first time I really experienced the power of media. Because I remember when that show came out, about 5 million people or so watched it each week in the UK. And I thought to myself, I remember the first weekend after it came out, I'd never been on telly before. I said to my wife, hey, babe, if 5 million people watch that, if 1% of people watching it make a positive improvement in their life based on what they saw, well, that's just 50,000 people you've impacted straight away. And if it's 10% of people who make a change, that's 500,000 people. And so I think something shifted in my head there. I thought, wow, there is an opportunity to share my knowledge, hopefully the insights I've learned over my career with people. Yes, one-on-one with patients, but more, I think, I would argue more effectively now through my books and through my podcast.
Because of reach. I don't think we'll pursue a sort of traditional chronological format during this conversation, Rangan. I think we'll just jump around willy-nilly, because already I want to both back up and move forward. So we'll do the little back up first, which is, how did you end up on the telly?
So, big turning point for me in my life, like it is for many, was the death of one of my parents. So my dad died in March 2013. I grew up in the northwest of England. I went to Edinburgh Medical School to study medicine. I was there for 6 years at uni. I spent 2 years working there, but during my time there, my dad became very sick. He had to retire from his job as a consultant at Manchester Royal Infirmary. He got the autoimmune disease lupus, and then his kidneys failed, and so he was on dialysis for 15 years. Okay, so I moved back from Edinburgh in 2003 to the northwest of England, where I still live now, to help my mum and my brother look after my dad. So that was a very, that really formed a lot of the way I see the world, because I was at medical school when Dad became ill. I was a practicing doctor in my early days, also trying to help my father with this chronic health condition, which gave me a lot of insights to what it's like on the other side. Okay, sure, I wasn't the patient, but I was part of a very sick patient's family. And then I could see the challenges for the healthcare system through a different lens than I could as a doctor. Now, for many years up to the point of Dad's death, I was getting a little bit frustrated, James, with some aspects of medicine. Okay, so again, I think my medical school education was fantastic,
Sure.
but I think what a lot of people, including my profession, still haven't got their heads around is the idea that the health landscape of the UK and many countries around the world has significantly changed over the last 30 to 40 years, okay? So 30 to 40 years ago, I think our healthcare system was set up pretty well, right? Mostly what we struggle with were what we call acute problems, right? You've got a problem, you go to see your doctor, he'll examine you, go, yes, you've got a cough, you've got a fever, you're bringing up sputum, this is a chest infection, here's a pill, take it 3 times a day, and in 1 week, your problem's gone, okay? That is effectively how this NHS that we have has been set up, in my view. Very good for acute problems, but the landscape has changed where the vast majority of what we see today as doctors is in some way related to the way we live our collective modern lives, okay? I'm not blaming people, to be really clear.
Yes, of
right?
course.
Life is tough for people. People are stressed out. They're in sedentary jobs. It's not that easy for many people to buy high-quality, nutritious food that's going to nourish them. But nonetheless, we have to accept that our lifestyles together are creating a lot of sickness. So what's that got to do with the question you asked me, right? I'm going to bring it back round to that, right? So this is the backdrop.
I'm not going to let you interview yourself.
This is
just for the record.
This is the backdrop
Go
to
on.
it, okay? So in essence, my frustration was that the one pill for every ill approach, which was effectively what I was taught in medical school, which works well for a chest infection and a pneumonia, it kind of doesn't work so well when someone comes in, depression, anxiety, gut problems, type 2 diabetes. So my frustration was, I'm not doing that much for my patients, right? I'm giving them pills, but I'm not helping them get to the root cause of their problems.
And why was your father's condition the catalyst for this kind of moment?
It was more that Dad, seeing what it was like for Dad, seeing that, look, modern medicine saved his life.
Yes.
Okay, modern medicine kept Dad alive for 15 years. I mean, I still believe, and I'm biased here, that one of the best inventions of modern medicine was the dialysis machine.
Sure.
Right? Why? Because I had 15 years with my father that if dialysis had not been invented, like I wouldn't have had those.
Right.
If your kidneys fail, you're done. But you have this artificial kidney to keep you alive, right? But I saw that all Dad's treatment was about symptom suppression. And so it wasn't directly that Dad's illness led to a light bulb moment. It was more, I was getting frustrated at various aspects of my career. I saw what it was like for my dad. Nothing was to do with the root cause of why he got that problem. Was there anything that could be done about it? It was about, oh, you've got this condition. Here are the drugs you're going to take now. And so when Dad died, that was the first time I had the time to explore, for me, is there another way to treat my patients? Right, because I was a carer for Dad, so I lived 5 minutes away. So in the last 6 months of Dad's life, this is what my life looked like. I was a GP in Timperley, so about a 50-minute drive from where I lived. I would get up at about 5 o'clock. I'd drive round to my mum and dad's. I'd help Dad get out of bed, shower, shave him. I'd then come back, try and see my wife and my little baby boy, drive to work. Sometimes at lunch, depending on what was going on, I'd try and nip and check Dad was okay. Same thing after work. It was really, really stressful. I'm not playing a pity card here, to be super clear.
No.
It was really, really stressful. And it was actually a conversation I had with my wife a few months after Dad died. She said, Rangan, you've been talking about this stuff for years, right? You've got time now. Why don't you go and explore this passion that you have for helping people get to the root causes? Does that make sense?
Of course it makes sense. And you couldn't save your dad. So if we return to the theme of mission, it's about saving other people or preventing other people from going down the path your dad goes down. You're very open about what you feel contributed to his wholeness, if you like, the wholeness of his illness, the stress and resentment and anger and overwork and all sorts of experiences, some of which will be unique to medicine, some of which will be unique to the immigrant experience or the Asian immigrant experience.
Yeah.
Your dad, Taran, came here from Kolkata, worked at Manchester Royal Infirmary, as you say, as a consultant. we grew up, we're of a similar age. I think you're 5 years younger than me. We grew up encouraged to admire workaholics, almost, didn't we? So that
Yeah.
there's a big change there in your outlook when you see what it did to your dad.
It's interesting. The whole story around my dad, his life and his death, has evolved for me, James, even over the last couple of years. Okay. So if you look at an autoimmune disease like illness, so autoimmune disease is very common.
Yes,
Okay.
but lupus is usually, as I think I've read you right, it's usually women in their 30s. It's not.
It's usually Caucasian women in their
Yes.
30s. As a rough kind of
Sure,
generalization, you don't typically see it in Indian men in their late 50s. It's not the classic archetype, as it were. So it actually took them about 6 to 9 months to actually even diagnose my dad. They didn't know what was causing his ill health. So, as we all do, or as many of us do, when one of our parents die, it causes a lot of questions to come up for us. You know, for me, the first time I started to ask myself what you could call existential questions after my dad died, I've
Because
never.
it's your first experience of mortality, really.
Yeah.
Or unexpected mortality,
yeah,
as opposed to just a great old age.
It's kind of interesting because as a doctor since 2001, I've seen mortality, I've seen death
Of course.
multiple times, but it lands differently.
Yeah, from a distance.
Even if you're close to your patients, there's
course.
still that distance there,
Yeah.
that psychological distance. As strange as it sounds, when Dad died, it was the first time that I actually thought, oh, wow, death does actually happen.
And it will happen to me.
And it will happen to me. And I remember in the months after my dad's death, I really struggled. It was a big hole in my life because not only is it a big deal when one of your parents die, I lived 5 minutes away from my dad. So I would see my dad every single day. So I couldn't almost distract myself and get on. Like it was right there in my face. I'd go for long walks and think. So his work was insane, right? And I know many people work, just to give people an idea, for 30 years, my dad slept 3 nights a week. So he was a consultant at Manchester Royal Infirmary in the day. And I can still remember, James, he would come home in his car maybe at about 6:30 p.m., right? He'd come through the door. Mum would have dinner ready for him in the kitchen. He'd have dinner. He'd then go upstairs to the bathroom. He'd shave. And then at 7 o'clock, a car would pick him up. And Dad would go out and do GP house calls all night. So he'd arrive back at 7 a.m., breakfast, shave, drive back into Manchester again to work as a consultant.
Why?
Good question. If Dad was here today, I've got a lot of questions I'd love to ask my dads. I think Dad was driven with this singular focus that I'm here to give my family in the UK, so my mum, me and my brother, a really good start in life, a great life, and to send money back home to his family. Now, I used to say, if we'd had this conversation 5 years ago, I would have probably said, I think my dad made a mistake. I think he thought that all of that success, right, would make him happy. But he fell for this myth that more money and more status at work, for example, is going to make you happy. But I've evolved my view, James. And it goes back to your question right at the start about trying to tie all the threads together for me about mission. My mission is to help every single person who I interact with. I want them to listen to my podcast and after each episode believe, I can be the architect of my own health and happiness. Right? I do believe that passionately. But I also realize it's unfair for me to judge anyone else's experience, right? So if my dad was alive today, there's one question I think I'd love to ask him, which is, Dad, was it worth it? Like, I'm looking at my dad's life through my eyes, and I can't do that. It's not fair. My dad might actually say, my mission, son, was to make sure you and your brother had the best education that we could give you.
Mission
And
accomplished.
look, son, at what you're doing today.
Yes, I'm
right?
sure he would.
6 best-selling books. Millions of people listen to your podcast each month, right? You've had your own TV show. You're inspiring people. My dad might say to me, I would take lupus and dialysis any day of the week. So I've evolved my view. So Dad's mission, I believe, was to give us a better life. And frankly, my dad and my mum gave me a great start in life.
It wouldn't be either or, though, would it? I mean,
No.
he could have done that without
I believe so, yeah.
burning the
but
candle at both ends in
I
quite the way that he did. But it's I suppose a generosity to his memory and a recognition that you could probably only arrive at once you became a parent yourself, of selflessness, of the parental drive to prioritise the child over.
And let's just bring it back to something perhaps more relatable. Throughout my career, James, the amount of patients who I have seen who wish they hadn't worked so hard is incredible, right? So let's take the theme of autoimmune illness for a minute. That includes lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, all kinds of things that people are struggling with. For many years, I would see a lot of autoimmune illness, right? Complex autoimmune illness. I used to really enjoy, as a doctor, to try and tease out what was going on. I would say in over 95% of cases, James, that in the 6 months preceding the diagnosis, there was heavy, heavy stress in that person's life.
The beginning with the chest infection doesn't touch the sides of conditions like that.
Yeah. And that's what I try and do with my books and podcasts, is trying to help people understand, no. There are factors that you can change that will influence these things.
And make change that lasts is the title of the new book, because we can all tinker at the edges, and it's interesting to do this in the first week in January, because we can all make New Year's resolutions, and some of them might even last until February. But of course, you're in the business of trying to make the relatively small changes that will stay.
Yeah, we know. Like, depending on which research paper you read, up to 80% of New Year's resolutions are, will fail.
Yes.
Right? So we know that, and that's inferred in the title, Make Change That Lasts. Yes. That's what people are looking for. And actually, James, chapter 8 in this book is all about busyness and this over-reliance we have on business. And if I could just share why I think this is such a big issue, right? We've got requirements from our boss, from our work. We've got all this thing piling up for us. And I accept that, A lot of time we do have too much to do, and actually maybe our boss is asking too much of us. I do accept that. But if you sort of zoom out and go, what's going on here? Why is it that a recent survey said that 88% of UK workers have experienced some degree of burnout in the past 2 years? I mean, that's a pretty damning indictment of the state of modern society, I would say, right? And I think one of the things that we don't think about enough is status, okay? So I write in that chapter about this idea that status is a universal driver in all humans. But status does not mean Instagram followers, radio listeners, your salary, what kind of office you have at work, right? Status is actually that feeling that we are of value to other people. That is a universal driver in all humans. And I hypothesize in that chapter that actually one of the reasons why I believe so many of us can't stop being on this rat race of busyness is because many of us now don't live near our tribes and our communities. We've moved away for work, for opportunity, right? My parents moved like continents to come and try and find a better life, right? If you still live in those tight tribes, like we used to, or you still live in the town where you grew up, around your parents, around your siblings, around your childhood friends, you get that sense of value on a regular basis, right? If you're a hunter-gatherer in a tribe, you knew your sense of value. I'm the person who gets the sweet potatoes. I'm the guy who goes out on hunts. I'm the person who guards the tribe at night. You had an immediate sense that, this is the value I offer to other people. And I think for some of us, not all of us, we're missing that sense that we are of value to others. And so I think we try and get it from our work.
And some jobs would deliver that, most obviously perhaps medicine, but other jobs will not. David Graeber, the left-wing philosopher, talks about bullshit jobs, talks about the number of outwardly high-status jobs that exist now that actually involve absolutely no contribution whatsoever to the human condition or to the improvement of other people's lives. And that is going to gnaw away at you subconsciously from the inside, a sense that what you're doing is ultimately pointless or unhelpful.
Yeah, and I think it goes, like, talking about this theme of making change that lasts. James, what's always driven me is trying to find the root cause of a problem, okay? So a patient comes in with a headache. I've never been content to go, I'll go through the diagnostic criteria, yes, of course, you rule
When you
out...
say never, when you were a young GP, were you already bucking a bit against this.
A little bit. When you're young, you don't, you're trying to, follow the rules.
Of
You're trying to
course.
do what you're meant to do. I always had this nagging frustration. I mean, there's one particular day that I remember early on in my career as a GP, where I literally, at the end of the day, I'd seen about 45 patients. I was knackered. And I just thought, Rangan, how many people have you actually helped today? Like, really helped? And I went down the entire list. And I honestly, hand on heart, Jane, said, I think I've really helped 20% of people. The other 80%, sure, I was professional, I was polite, I was caring. But I thought I've even given them a pill to suppress a symptom that I knew they'd be back in a few weeks. I might have sent them for a test or something, but I kind of knew I hadn't really got to the root cause. And that gnawed away at me, James, for years.
Well, I'm going to back up even further in a minute, but before I do, the best example in the book of what you're describing is probably the woman you met when you were doing the television program who had fibromyalgia, and you explain that you didn't want to help her manage her pain. You wanted to take her pain away. And it opened up a Pandora's box of surprising experiences for you that you write about very powerfully and persuasively. But that's the point. Somebody in chronic pain could go to the doctor and be given something that reduced their pain and go home thinking that they'd been helped. If you were that doctor, you would not feel that you had helped them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think actually that's an interesting case to talk about, right? That was in the first series of Doctor in the House, which aired on BBC One in 2015. And I actually do believe that documentary series was actually a few years ahead of its time.
Yes.
I really do believe that in terms of where the public consciousness was about chronic disease and what can be influenced by the way that we live. That was one of the controversial cases on that first series. And what was really interesting, James, right, is that I had to really push against the BBC on in the way I managed Nicola. Well, that was her name. Basically, I agreed to do the series on the premise that I had full medical autonomy. And when I arrived to sort of start my process with Nicola, who had fibromyalgia, she had IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, depression, anxiety. She'd picked up about 7 or 8 different diagnoses over the course of her years with her doctors. And she was in chronic pain. She couldn't walk around the block. She couldn't work. She couldn't be a mother to her 3 children. And I thought, okay, I don't know what's going on here, but I think we need to get rid of the labels first of all. Okay, let's pretend there are no labels here. Let me just look at you as a fresh human being. And yes, I was one-on-one with her, so it was easier to do it than in a consultation room. 6 weeks later, James, she was pain-free. Now, when I started with her, the BBC said, Rangan, we've arranged a consultation with a top pain consultant in London. I said, what have you done that for? They said, he'll help get the medications just right to manage her pain. And I said, guys, listen, you cancel that, right? I don't want to manage her pain. I want to see if I can get her out of pain. And they said, how are you going to do that? I said, listen, I don't know, but let me get to know her. Let me see if I can figure it out. Now, what was really interesting, James, is that, yes, 6 weeks later, she was pain-free. 2 years later, because I stayed in touch with her, with no more input from me, she had gone from basically 20 pills a day to 0 pills a day because I'd empowered her with the things that she could do. But what was super interesting is when that show came out, this was my first experience with being on Twitter, okay? I'm sure you've had many experiences on Twitter. 99% of the feedback was phenomenal. Wow, it's incredible to see, what can be done when we can help people, empower them with what they can do in their lives. But there was a very vicious group who were savaging me online and saying this is ridiculous, that she didn't have fibromyalgia, even though she had all the letters from all the consultants and it was properly diagnosed. And initially I was like, oh my God, I don't know how to handle this. Yeah. And once I'd settled down, I started to look at who was commenting, and it was people who had a handle, Fibro Jane, Fibro Tash, Fibro Tom. And I got it. I thought, you know what? I get it. You're in a lot of pain and discomfort in your life. You might, like many patients with fibromyalgia do, they feel as though their doctors are not listening to them and are not properly helping them with their condition. It is too much to put on the telly in the evening and watch someone in 6 weeks apparently undergo a miracle. And so I get it. I get why they push back at me. Like, I actually now really have compassion. I was like, I get it. You take it out on me, and I'm okay with that.
think it came from? I know we've spoken about your dad, and you had a very traumatic experience with your son as well, which made you question a lot of your own confidence in your own abilities. But I want to go back even further. What were you like as a child? Were you a pain in the backside for your teachers? Were you constantly asking questions they couldn't answer?
I don't know. Was I a pain in the backside? I think if you ask my brother, possibly, right? Because it's my
Well,
big
that goes without saying, doesn't it?
Wouldn't my teachers say that? I don't know. Like, it's interesting. Being the child of immigrants, I think gives you quite an interesting experience of the world. Okay, look, we've all got our own individual experience of the world, so I can only look at it through my lens and sort of try and put a story that makes sense to me. But I grew up with mum and dad who are from Calcutta in India, so at home there's a kind of Indian background. And then I grew up in an area where we're probably the only Indian family. Apart from me and my brother at school, I think everyone else is Caucasian, which is completely fine. I don't have any issue with that. I had a very happy in both of the schools that I went to. But I think you have this sort of conflict where at school you've been exposed to certain ideas, and at home you've been exposed to other sort of cultural ideas. And I think what I ended up doing, James, is I think for most of my life I've been very, very insecure.
Okay.
Until the last few years, I would say. So I don't think until even 3 or 4 years ago, I actually truly knew who I was and what my desires were. Does that make sense?
Of course it does. Except that to challenge your training and your education in the way that you were doing when you were still insecure demands enormous confidence.
Yeah, it's a great point. So there's an apparent conflict there.
Is there also something else? Is there a duality? So because you can live parallel lives, I think I've understood you correctly, as living a slightly different life or a very different life at home from the one you would live at school. Because you can live parallel lives, it makes you realise there is no such thing as the correct track.
Agreed. I was chatting to a mate last weekend about this. I said, I wonder how much my upbringing has... Look, I think travel, right? I think when we travel the world, if you're able to, if you're lucky enough, you can afford to do it, you have the opportunity to, it's pretty phenomenal what it does for your brain, because you're just like, oh, wow, people live in completely different ways, in harmony, in a way that's completely different to how people live where I live, for example. And it's very freeing and liberating. And I wonder if you are exposed to two cultures at a young age, you kind of see that very early on.
I do too now.
That you're like, there's no one way.
Yes, exactly.
It's like, both ways have validity.
And you can carry that into every other aspect of life.
Exactly.
There is
and you've really, it's such an interesting question for me, which I've never really thought about. I don't think I've been asked it before, James. This idea that if I was so insecure, which is a story I tell myself, how is it that I sort of quite publicly pushed against the conventional way of treating patients? And so I think, I don't think there's anything that is black and white in life, right? I think on elements of me were deeply insecure, but of course I did have that inner confidence somewhere to go, no, I know there's a different way.
Yes. Or I know there could be a different way.
But I tell you what, okay, this is interesting because I'm processing this in real time. I would say, even when Doctor in the House was out and I was helping these patients get some quite incredible results and lots of people were seeing it, I still had this deep need to be validated by others.
Okay.
That's what's changed in the last few years, okay? So chapter 3 in this book is Be Yourself, this over-reliance on being liked by others. I would say what's different today, James, compared to any other time in my career, is I no longer need anyone listening to this conversation, reading this new book, listening to my podcast. I don't need them to agree with me anymore. No, this is the way I see the world. I'm confident in what I believe and these ideas. If you see the world differently to me, I'm okay with that. We live in a world of 8 billion people. Not everyone's going to see it the way that I see it.
And this is why you write about the power of the phrase, I have a different perspective.
Yeah,
it's not saying I'm right, you're wrong. You could never be a phone-in host.
Yeah, well, I don't know how you do what.
Well, I've changed as well, actually. Therapy brought me on a a journey
Well,
not dissimilar to the one you
I've seen some of
described.
the YouTube footage of callers coming into you and how you handle them, and the sort of what you're faced with on your show. A lot of the time, one of my favorite chats in this book is chapter 5. It's called "Take Less Offense,"
Yeah.
and in that, and I was thinking, I wonder what you will think to this, right? One of the ideas I put forward in there, which relates to this, I have a different perspective, is this idea that nothing is inherently offensive. Okay, it can't be. And the way I explain it to people, I go, if the thing was offensive, right? If that thing or that comment was inherently offensive, then every single person on the receiving end of it would find it offensive. The fact that we all don't means it's not the thing. There's something within us that's been activated by that external event or that comment. Now, I'm not saying that means people aren't, making some heinous comments and some hateful comments. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is the act of taking offense is actually an individual act. We are choosing on some level to take offense, and we can also train ourselves to not take offense. Now, I very much have done that over the last few years, and that I have a different perspective is 5 words that I offer to people in this book. And I say, listen, if you're someone who's constantly disagreeing with people, fighting with your friends, disagreeing with your partner, I mean, I don't know the stats in the UK, James, but when I spoke to the US Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, a few months ago on my podcast, he said to me at that time, and this is way before the US election, he said that 1 in 6 Americans are no longer talking to a family member because of a difference in opinion over politics. I thought, wow, this is that's really interesting to observe that and take zoom out a bit and go, what's going on? You, for example, might have had a great relationship with your auntie your entire life, but because she is voting for a different party, you're no longer going to talk to her.
And for people who don't understand what that's got to do with the broad, because they haven't read Make Change That Lasts yet, I mean, you're talking about all of the things that contribute to negativity within us, all of the things that make us tense, that make us stressed, that threaten our equilibrium and therefore can contribute to more obviously physical malaise.
It's not only that, James. To make it super practical, right? In January, I would say many people, whether you're into health or not, are trying to reset. And there's maybe some behaviors that they engage with, maybe too much alcohol, maybe too much sugar, maybe too much time scrolling Instagram in the evening, online pornography, whatever it might be. People are trying to reset. And I've said
because they know.
They know on some level that there's something slightly off, and January the 1st seems to be a good way of bringing it all home, going, right, this year. So why is it that 80% of these New Year's resolutions, as it were, fail? It's not because people aren't trying hard enough or they don't want it enough. I believe it's because they're not getting to the root cause, right? So one of the root causes that I don't think we talk about enough, and I think it's a very fresh idea in this new book of mine for people, is this idea that if you've got this internal stress, right, because you're taking offense to everything, or you're screaming at everyone, or you're rowing with your partner, you don't realize that that emotional stress that you have created by the way you interact with that external event, it's not neutral, James. You will need to neutralize it in some way, right? Now, you can do that in a healthy way, going for a walk, going to the gym, or more commonly, we go to the vending machine, have a bit of sugar, have an extra coffee, have an extra beer, online pornography, 3 hours doom scrolling. And so we don't realize that those behaviors are an inevitable consequence of the internal emotional stress that we've got. And so I say to you, James, right, let's take a few years ago, right, when, let's say, you've got callers coming in, they're calling into your radio show, and they're being pretty punchy with their view, and you're trying to handle this. You're being listened to by lots of people. You, I'm guessing, got worked up sometimes in some of those conversations. Okay, right. So you're interacting, you've got worked up. Do you remember, after the show had finished, what you would then do? Would you, for example, need a bit of extra sugar?
This is where I have the advantage on you, because I've read your book and you obviously haven't read mine. So my therapy journey talks about the difference in about 6 or 7 years ago, not long after I lost my dad, realizing that I was being unhelpful to people in my life as a consequence of things that I've been carrying probably since I started getting beaten at prep school. So working through that in therapy did actually directly speak to where you're
There you
going
go.
now, and help me understand, which is why I find so much of what you've written about so utterly compelling. I should also say that 10 years ago, I lost my dad in 2012. I would have laughed at any kind of book that told me you could make incremental change. I'd have laughed at therapy. I laughed at therapy when I went there, and this is why I like. I don't know if holistic is a word you like. I mean, it's a.
So people will use it to refer to what I
I
do.
thought they might, but it's not quite there, is it?
I don't naturally resonate with it. I don't use it
No, I
myself.
understand why. That's why I asked, because it sounds a bit woo for a start, but what I found extraordinary and quite, I don't know, almost like welcoming about this from a personal perspective and from the things that we talk about on the radio show is the mission you set out at the very beginning of the book, which is to work out why so many of us who know that there is something wrong and know what we need to do to be better don't do it. And you use the example of your GP friend, and it's an incredibly so I've had callers who say, why should I listen to a nurse who's fat? And you have a GP friend who has precisely that experience, and you tell it in, I mean, quite sort of arresting terms when your friend phones you or you're speaking to a GP friend who's just tried to deter someone from a path of diabetes, like an inevitable journey towards serious diabetes, and they say, why should I listen to you? You're fatter than I am.
Yeah.
And that takes you to the point where you realise, or it crystallises the knowledge, that so many people have the knowledge.
Yeah.
But they still don't do what they need to be
and
done.
when I met her that weekend, because she was very upset by this.
I bet she was.
When I met her, though, because some people will
She had chocolate buttons in her desk drawer. It's a wonderful image.
Yeah.
While telling this man to change his diet.
That was the fourth or fifth introduction I wrote. Remember when I met her that weekend, she said, because some people will get sidetracked and going, a patient shouldn't be talking to their doctor like that. That's not the point I'm trying to make, right? And to my friend's credit, she didn't sidetrack. She said, Rangan, the thing is, my patient was right.
Yeah.
Whilst I'm counselling him about excess sugar and ultra-processed foods, in my drawer are Cadbury's giant buttons, right? And I use that to make this point that I think a lot of people, health and wellness is very, very big and popular these days, right? I use that case of Helen to show people that go, look, it's not more external knowledge that you necessarily need. It's more internal knowledge, more self-awareness, more insight. Very simply, let's take alcohol, right, James? At this time of year, so many people after the excesses at Christmas are trying to cut out or reduce alcohol. But the way I try and simply put it for people is, if the way you manage the stress in your life is by using alcohol, you can try and quit in January. You can do dry January. You can white knuckle it. Most people will end up back to where they were before.
Because the stress hasn't gone away.
Unless one or two things has happened. Either the stress has had to have gone down, easier said than done, or you need to find an alternative behavior to alcohol to manage the stress. I think when I put it like that, I think it's quite obvious, but I don't think we think about it when we're trying to change our life. We just go straight to the damn behavior.
But also there's a vicious circle, which I think, there's a reason why doctors have a lot of issues that you would expect them not to have by dint of their medical knowledge. It's because their lives are very stressful. They have to deliver appalling news. They have to witness appalling things. They have to work appalling hours. None of this is news to anybody. And if I always used to call it accelerated relaxation. So you have that little 2-hour window where you want to feel more than 2 hours worth of relaxed. So people might roll a joint, or they might pour a drink, or they might do some of the other things that you've listed, because they're trying to cram more relaxation than is actually possible in the time available. And a lot of doctors I've known who've had extraordinarily unhealthy lifestyles have almost been sort of professionally pursuing a place of temporary calm, which was actually going to make them more stressed in the long run.
Yeah, 100%. And often, what do we, what is it that we often use to give us that temporary calm? It's often these problematic behaviors.
Yes, precisely.
The alcohol,
yes.
For example. And, right at the start, we spoke about mission, didn't we, and purpose. One thing I've also noticed, James, both as direct work with one-on-one with patients, but also through all the interactions I have with the public through my podcast, is this idea that if you have, and I accept that some people have no choice, right? But if you have a job that you really don't like, that you don't feel is off service, and
Yeah.
you're doing things for others, I find often that we seek, often the alcohol, that, the getting drunk on a Friday and Saturday is often a compensation for that.
Yes.
Because we don't get that sense of fulfillment in the week, whether you call it a numbing, a distracting, we almost have to rebalance at the weekends. Whereas I found people, when they are able to have a job with more purpose, with more meaning, often those problematic behaviors start to disappear as a natural byproduct.
But as you acknowledge, that is
Easier said than done.
much easier said than
Yeah,
done. And I mean, what do you say to people who say this all sounds well and good, but I simply can't afford it? I know that you're not telling people to spend money on things, but I can't afford to make changes. I certainly can't afford to change jobs.
Okay.
I can't afford to change my life.
Yeah.
For people who would say that the whole wellness movement is inevitably middle class.
Yeah, I strongly disagree with that.
I know you do.
Yeah, and I hear that all the time. And one thing I think...
So just to explain why I'm asking that question, it comes from a place of guilt, because I don't know yet whether or not it's going to land as heavily with me as I think it might. Your new book, Make Change That Lasts. But if it does, I will wonder, from a place of guilt, whether it's because I have the space and time in my life to adopt a lot of the
so there's a couple.
tactics you
Yeah,
describe.
it's a great question, and I think it's often the elephant in the room around health and wellness. So I think it's good that we bring it up. Okay, so there's a couple of ways of answering that, because when we're thinking about access and privilege and the ability to make these changes, right, we can look at it through the lens of money and time. Okay, so pretty much everything I've ever spoken about in public when it comes to health and happiness and well-being, I would say 99% of it is free of charge. I'm quite conscious, even in this book, all the exercises, like using that phrase, I have a different perspective, that cost you £0. You don't need more time in your life. It's just a useful tool to keep in your back pocket next time you disagree with your boss or your partner, right?
Just turns the volume down.
Just turns the volume down. So these are practical things that can be very helpful. They don't cost money. Secondly, there was a 7-year period in my career where I worked right in the centre of Oldham in what you would consider, I hate these terms, but it would be considered a deprived practice or an area of low socioeconomic status. Okay, lots of people on benefits, working multiple jobs. I got some of the best results of my career in that practice. Okay, because if you are compassionate, if you have empathy and you don't lecture people and you treat them like human beings and say, look, I think this is going to help you, even if you're time pressured, there are a few simple things that you can do which do make a difference, right? So that's the other thing I want to say. And then the third point around this, I get it. Much of health and wellness, like if we take it as a cliche, the cold plunge, the sauna, the
coffee enemas,
right? I get it. You need money,
sure,
time, access. And actually, the truth is, some of them can be really helpful if you have time, money, and access.
Yes.
Go for your life and enjoy it. I'm not against them, but I'm also aware that the vast majority of the population can't access that. And so one of my favorite pieces of advice that I give to people is, I can't remember which chapter it's in, but it's basically about do a 5-minute action for yourself each day. And the reason is they're the same two questions we ask ourselves when we meet another human being for the first time, which is, can I trust them? Can I rely on them? We also ask ourselves those two questions every day. When you say you're going to do something and you don't, you basically show your subconscious on a daily basis, I can't trust myself, I can't rely on myself, right? So I've said on my podcast on many occasions that one thing I do every morning is, whilst my coffee brews for 5 minutes, I do a 5-minute strength workout in my pajamas in my kitchen, right? I don't go anywhere, I don't have to join a gym, it doesn't cost me any money. But it's just like brushing my teeth. I don't miss a day. It's nothing to do with willpower and motivation. Why that's so powerful, James, I even did it in my hotel room in London this morning. Just like I brushed my teeth in my hotel room, right? It's not as if, I'm on holiday. I'm in London to do some interviews.
Yeah.
And it shows me every day that no matter how busy I am, no matter how stressed I might be, no matter what my wife might need me to do, what my children might need me to do, I still show up for myself every single day. And I use that when I was working in Oldham with people who don't have much money, who didn't have much access and privilege in life. These kind of daily habits, I promise, they change the way that we view ourselves. It's not going to suddenly say you're going to earn more money
Sure.
and you're not going to have stress from your boss, but that feeling of self-esteem and self-worth you get when you do that daily practice, it's priceless and it doesn't cost anything.
And the burden of problems that we all carry gets lighter. You're not necessarily saying I'm going to take it away completely, but it will be lighter. And if it's lighter, everything else gets easier.
Your ability to interact with that stressful situation at work changes when you have a different view of yourself, right? Breath work is again something we go, oh, breath work. Hey, listen, there's a lot of science on breath work, okay? One of the breathing practices that I've shared with my patients for years is called the 3-4-5 breath. And I'm bringing this up around this whole wellness might be deemed as middle class, okay? The 3-4-5 breath is very simple.
Breathing. You can't get much more democratic.
You breathe in for 3,
hold for 4.
You hold for 4 and breathe out for 5. Okay,
yes.
So anytime your out breath is longer than your in breath, you basically help to switch off the stress part of your nervous system and promote the relaxation part. Okay, so let's go back now to someone who's not earning much money, who doesn't like their job and feels stressed all the time. If I can teach you a 1-minute breathing practice that will cost you £0 and hardly cost you any time, I'm saying that I can't change your job and what your boss asked you to do, but the way you are when you interact with that is completely different. And it will start to change your life because I've seen it.
I don't know if I should say this bit out loud.
That means you should.
What?
That means you should.
I've just remembered. It's been buzzing away very gently in the back of my mind since we sat down. Because we've not met properly before. We sort of passed each other in a... I've just remembered who you remind me of. And extraordinarily, he went to the same school as you.
Who is it?
Martin Lewis.
Did Martin Lewis go to MGS?
I think he did.
Wow. I didn't know that.
But the evangelism that you have for what you do is of a piece with the evangelism that he has for what he does. And quite a lot of what you just said, particularly when we moved into the area of economic health, there are parallels there. You are driven to help people that you are never going to meet.
Yeah. I am. I know maybe my insecurities come out at the start to say, I know that sounds like a cliche doctor saying he wants to help people.
Well, he's not a doctor. It comes from somewhere else.
I believe genuinely, and I, this is what people will often tell me.
It's that use of the word genuinely that resonates. I don't know why you feel the need to say it. It's obvious. It shines out of you. But Martin's exactly the same. Why on earth has Martin dedicated his career to trying to help people's financial health with tools that are available to everybody? Things that this frustration you feel that people can't quite reach a place they could get to where everything would get better. I'm struck by the parallels.
That's interesting. I wonder if there's something in our upbringings and where we went to school, like what is the culture around you in terms of infusing these ideas?
Yeah, so am I now. I've got to get you together.
Although I would have to say,
I mean that as a very high compliment.
Oh,
well,
I appreciate that. I really appreciate that. And I'm just, again, it's really interesting. You're getting to think about things I haven't really thought about for a while. Every other summer when I was growing up, we'd go to India for 6 weeks in the summer. So Dad had only come for about 2 weeks. That's all the holiday he could get. But we'd stay there with Mum. And that's the only time I got to see my grandparents and my cousins. And I always remember we'd get off the long flight at the airports. And we'd get in these kind of black and yellow ambassador taxis and go to my dad's family's house, about like a 40-minute ride. I remember it was such a contrast to where I grew up in Cheshire. Yes. And, you'd see real poverty. And I remember, I've got this image of being on this busy street in India and clearly families with nothing, right? Living on the street. These little kids were squatting, brushing their teeth on the pavement. Everyone's smiling, the mum's smiling, they're having fun. And maybe there's something in my upbringing of spending 6 weeks in India every other summer and seeing real poverty in front of me. Like, I never ever want, like when you talk about health and wellness being middle class, I guess part of it pains me in some way because I know that's an assertion that people make.
Yes.
And I understand why they make it. I'm trying my best to fight back and go, not even fight back, just say, hey guys, yeah, there are some elements which are, But there's many elements which aren't as well.
Which is why mass media has been so helpful to you. Why being able to reach parts that other medical practitioners cannot reach has been such a crucial part of your journey.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, for sure.
I've got very little image, and I normally have quite a good picture at the end of these interviews of the childhood version of my guest. I don't have much image of little Rangan at the moment. Still, were you always going to be a doctor?
I don't think so. I don't. Yeah, I used to be obsessed with music.
Yes, I saw that. You took 2 years off, I think, to tour yourself.
Yeah, I took at least a year off medicine in my mid-20s to record a solo EP and go around the country playing it. I loved it. I think I wanted to be a rock and roll star when I was 7, 8, 9. I mean, my mum tells a story that I was obsessed with Top of the Pops, and I just berated her until she got me guitar lessons, right? As I describe in chapter 2, I used to have a life-size flag of John Bon Jovi in my bedroom wall, and I literally thought I want to be John Bon Jovi when I'm older. And that's all about, the reason I share that story is about the problems with hero worship and this growing rates of perfectionism in society and how toxic it is. But I think I really want to be a rock and roll star to the point where at medical school, I remember after 2 years, I took a year out to do immunology. You do an intercalated degree. I came home that Christmas, and I don't think I meant it. I think I was just trying to push back at mum and dad's. I said, yeah, guys, I think I'm going to quit med school and go on the road with my bands. And it was a pretty eventful Christmas because I don't think Dad talked to me for a few days. I think he was just trying to ignore me, and Mum was trying to keep the peace between me and Dad. And Mum was like, hey, listen, I know you love music, okay, it's great, And my mum is a really, really good singer. And she was like, no, why don't you just get your medical degree first and then see what you do? Then you've always got that behind you. But again, talking about cliches, there's a lot of Indian kids from immigrant families who are doctors. Why? It is heavily, heavily valued in our culture, right? So it's interesting when people say, why did you become a doctor? I'm like, yeah, I've always wanted to care and help people, but I've got to be completely honest. Like, you probably had guests before who've said this, but literally the way I was brought up, you kind of think there are 2 to 3 options available to you: doctor, lawyer, engineer. Everyone around you, that's what they're doing. That's what your parents, friends, kids are doing. That's what you see them, getting applause or go, oh, have you heard about this person's son? They've just gone into medical school. So of course, as a child, that's what you value. And so I also believe that many people end up in medicine who shouldn't be in medicine.
Yeah, okay.
I think there's a real downside to that as well. People do it because they think they should. Oh, I'm a straight A student. My parents think, my culture says medicine's a good career.
But no vocation.
Yeah. Whereas I don't think I had that.
Okay.
So what was I as a kid? I was a musician. I was, I don't know. I think I was probably a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde. I was probably very good with my teachers at school, and I probably came back home and played havoc around mum and dad and my brother, I think is probably the best way of describing it.
You've touched a couple of times on, and I feel we could do 3 or 4 different interviews looking at some of the different themes that we've talked about today and that come up in Make Change That Lasts. But you've mentioned a couple of times or alluded to countries where they do things differently, cultures where they do things differently, cultures where historically that diagnostic template that you outlined at the very beginning of the interview is not the gospel by which almost all doctors operate, at the altar at which almost all doctors worship. What sort of places are we thinking about?
I guess if you look at, what would be called traditional forms of medicine, let's say traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic medicine, which is thousands of years old in India, it's really interesting over the past few years what we now see with modern science. We're now seeing how a lot of what those guys were talking about, we've now got modern science to prove. Okay, so let's give some examples. So I reckon 20 years ago or so, if we were talking about meditation, me and you here on this podcast, even though podcast didn't exist 20 years ago, so let's say on the radio, it probably would have been deemed a bit woo-woo and a bit out there. Oh, meditation, what's that going to do? Whereas we've now, in multiple prestigious institutions around the world, we can show it can change brain structure, improve focus, concentration, help with depression, etc., right? And I think we've had a bit of an arrogance in modern society that actually we're the first generation, or we're the humans who've figured it out. And
because of the chemistry, because we've discovered the
yeah,
chemicals.
yeah. Whereas we're like, actually, I'm not saying everything from these traditional medical modalities is necessarily true, but I'm saying we should be a bit more open-minded and go, oh, there's quite a bit there that actually might be holding true. In Ayurvedic medicine, they've always had this idea. I think I've discovered this in the last few years, where when a patient comes in with a chronic illness, they put them into one of three frameworks, and depending on which framework they're in, they're called the Vata, basically VATA. They will be prescribed a slightly different form of diet. Okay, what are we learning now in the last 2 or 3 years? We're learning that there's a whole field called personalized nutrition, that we're all different and we all respond differently to different foods. For many years, we poo-pooed what traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine was saying. And again, to be clear, I'm not saying everything has been found to be true. What I'm saying is that a lot of things are now being found, wait a minute, there's actually some validity to what these guys are saying. And then when you take a step back, you go, does it seem reasonable that we are the first set of humans on the planet to have figured out what makes a human being healthy? Or might it be that there might have been some other cultures who might have something valuable to offer us? So, I don't know, like turmeric, right? Turmeric has now been shown in multiple scientific papers over the last years to be anti-inflammatory, to switch off something called NF-kappa B, an inflammatory mediator. Hey, I remember as a kid, right, if I had a cold, Mum would put extra turmeric in my food. She'd give me hot water with turmeric. And I probably thought, what's Mum doing? Oh, it turns out maybe there's something there. Do you know what I mean? So
I do, yes.
I just think we all need to be a little bit more open-minded and not shut things down and go, well, maybe there's things out there that could work.
I don't know where you... One or two more questions. The personal ambition is, I'm going to ask you about ambition, but I don't want you to talk about wanting to help people. And I don't mean that in a dismissive way. I just mean that we've covered it fairly comprehensively already. You enjoy being successful. I know you write powerfully about status. But can you separate the two? You enjoy being successful because you're helping so many people. You must look at your book sales. You must look at your podcast figures. Do you derive pleasure from the numbers alone?
Not anymore.
But okay, that works as an argument. Because I was going to say, if you say no, I won't believe you, but you didn't.
Not
You
anymore.
said not anymore.
And I want to also acknowledge that it's very easy to say you're not bothered by that stuff once you've got it.
Yes, well, I agree.
Right?
Yes.
So I can say that, and someone could easily go, oh, all right for you, mate. Yeah, and I accept that.
Yeah.
When you've got all the external validation that you could have ever dreamt of as an insecure little boy,
Yes.
it's very easy to go, that stuff doesn't matter.
And you can't know for sure.
And I can't, no. So the way, maybe the best way to answer this is how I look at success now. Okay. And in that chapter on business, I talk about how you might want to look at a successful life. And I say, look at life in 5 buckets. Okay. Work, family, friendship, health, and passion. And again, if it works for you, great. If it doesn't, ignore it. But I'm saying it's quite a useful way of looking at your life and going, which of these buckets is being filled up?
Yeah.
And which one's a little bit empty? My work bucket is full. Okay. I don't need to push harder at work. If I actually need to chill out a bit with work and go, no, actually, you know what? Most podcasters would literally give their left arm to have the sort of downloads that I get, right? I am aware of that, and I'm aware of, I could downplay it and go, I'm lucky to have that, and yes, I am. I guess I'd also, I work diligently in my podcast. I don't have a researcher. I prepare.
Yeah, these things don't happen by accident.
Yeah, and I've sort of week after week for 7 years, I've been putting out a long form show, right?
Yeah.
But the point is, so as I look at my life in 2025, I look at those 5 buckets and go, the 2 that I think are being underfilled at the moment are my friendships, right? I don't have many friends around where I live. I've got some amazing mates from uni who I could trust with my life, but I don't see them as much as I would like.
You write very powerfully about one of them, don't you, Steve?
Yeah, Steve, and that's
certainly a beautiful story. In fact, the book is full of beautiful stories. So I like that because
friendship and passion are 2 things I want to bring up this year. I want to go, those buckets are a little bit underfilled. So I want it in 2025. I would say for me, the way I look at a successful life is, can I spend more time with my friends? And can I spend more time on my passions outside of work?
Make Change That Lasts by Dr. Rangan Chatterjee is out now. 9 simple ways to break free from the habits that hold you back. Of all the authors I've interviewed, I feel more of a need with this book to suggest that it does much more than any cover could convey. Just treat yourself to the introduction, and I guarantee you will want to read the rest of it. Rangan, thank you.
Thanks for having me, James.